Welcome everyone to the Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Department seminar. My name is Tate Rutherford. I'm a master's student in the department. I'm working with Professor Courtney Schultz. I'm here this afternoon to introduce to you all Dr. Linda Nagel, who is our department head and a professor of silviculture here. Briefly, before she came to CSU, she was professor of silviculture and director of operations at the Cloquet Forestry Center and the Hubachek Wilderness Research Center at the University of Minnesota. She also held a position from 2000 to 2013 as professor of silviculture at Michigan Tech University. She has taught professional training programs for 15 years, including the National Advanced Silviculture Program. She holds degrees in biology and natural resource sciences from South Dakota State University and Washington State University, and she completed her doctoral work in forestry at the University of Montana. Her current research focuses on adaptive silvicultural strategies, habitat restoration, and forest vegetation dynamics. And her presentation for us today is called An Introduction to the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Dr. Linda Nagel.
Thank you, Tate. That was impressive amount of information you had there. So thank you for joining us today for the seminar, and there was a switch in the schedule, and so what today is going to look like is I'm going to give you an overview of this project called the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Project, and that'll take somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, and then we'll hand it over to Jacob, who's going to give a more elaborate explanation of one aspect of that project. So I want to acknowledge at least some of the major partners on this project, and I'll kind of give you the genesis of where this project came from and came about. When I was at Michigan Tech, I was teaching these training programs, and we had developed a module for climate change that we incorporated into the silviculture training, and that caught the attention of some of the National Forest Service folks who, and this was back in about 2008 or 9, and they developed a strong interest and acknowledgement that climate change was this really big issue that land managers needed to start grappling with, but we didn't have any really good examples of on-the-ground practices, or what would adaptive management for climate change look like. And so one of the first partners in this project was Jim Goulden, who is in the Southern Research Station. Courtney Peterson is the coordinator for this project, and Molly Roski was a coordinator for the project prior to Courtney. Chris Swanston and Maria Genoviak are both with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and they've been partners on this project from the very beginning as well. Brian Palick is a Forest Service scientist who leads one of our sites, the site that's in Minnesota. Mike Battaglia, who most of you know, is a scientist with Rocky Mountain Research Station, and he leads a site here in Colorado. Seth Bigelow and Steve Jack are from the J.W. Jones Ecological Research Center in Georgia, and they are site leads for that area. And then we have a site in Montana, and that site is led by Elaine Kennedy Sutherland and Terry Jane, who are both scientists in Rocky Mountain Research Station. And then we have a site in the Northeast on a private property called the Second College Grant, and that site is led by Tony D'Amato and Chris Woodall. Tony is a professor at the University of Vermont, and Chris Woodall is a scientist with a project leader with the U.S. Forest Service. We also have a number of really key collaborators who are managers at these sites, and they're sort of co-leads on the project as well. So we know our climate is changing. Some of the major climate changes that we're thinking about in terms of forests and helping forests adapt to future climate are, of course, changes in our temperature, changes in precipitation regimes, changes in the length of our growing seasons, and this particular diagram is showing changes in heavy precipitation events. And so even places that are mesic are experiencing changes in climate that will impact how forests function and what they look like in the future. And so particularly in the eastern United States, it's less about drought, although that is a concern, but sometimes it's more about extreme events and how can we build resilience to extreme events. And so the question for forest managers then becomes, how do we integrate climate change information into our practices? And how do we create ecosystems that might be more adaptive to those climate changes into the future? And so we are interested in this project in developing on-the-ground actions as examples and in a scientifically robust manner that allow us to develop forest resilience and enable adaptation under uncertain future conditions. So I'm a silviculturist by training, and so we think a lot about desired future conditions. What do we want conditions to be like in the future? And that's a really important step for us to think about before we develop management practices to get there. And so our common practice is to take a look at our current condition and to think about what do we want that condition to be like in the future. A lot of times we think about what has it been in the past. And we're thinking about restoration. Tony talked a lot about restoration and adaptive management a couple of weeks ago. And that is one way for us to define that future. One of our challenges is we don't know what exactly the impact of climate change is going to have on forest vegetation dynamics into the future. We know it's going to be impactful, but we don't necessarily understand what those impacts might be. And so approaching this from an adaptation perspective can be very helpful in creating systems that are going to be able to be resilient into the future. So we often talk about adaptation to climate change along a spectrum of options. And so here we have resistance, resilience, and transition. These are terms that we've defined and are using as part of this project. And the basic schematic here is that here on this end of the spectrum, we're managing for persistence. So the system is recognizable in its nature and its function as it is now, today. And along this gradient, if we move in this direction, here we're managing for change. So we're thinking about how do we enable ecosystems to better adapt to what we think the future climate conditions might be. And this is a really more active approach to developing management strategies. Okay, so they'll fundamentally be changed to something that's different from what it is today. So the big question for us is what actions can be taken to enhance the ability of a system to cope with that change and also to meet the management goals and objectives for a given landowner. So this project, as I mentioned, sort of grew out of some of these training programs that we were doing where we were bringing climate change information and some tools and trainings to land managers. And I partnered immediately with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science because they had been developing these tools and procedures to help managers really contemplate climate change and bring those considerations into their management decisions. And Chris Swanston was here last year giving a presentation, and he really walked through very nicely what that process looked like. So immediately, so this was maybe 8 years ago or so, immediately we realized that these theoretical concepts of resistance, resilience, transition intellectually made sense, but when we started applying those concepts to different ecosystem types, it became much more complicated and not as straightforward. And so we convened what we called a science team to really help us refine those definitions and build the structure around what this project has become, including the experimental design and all of that. So that included Brian Palak from the Northern Research Station, Linda Joyce right here from Fort Collins at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, Connie Millar, who has done a lot of work with climate change adaptation from PSW, Dave Peterson from PNW, and then Lisa Gagno is a statistician from Oregon State University. And those folks, we spent a couple of years talking through all of these considerations before we really built this project. And then the blue stars on this map show all the sites that we've developed so far, and I'll talk a little bit about each one of them here shortly. So this is the adaptive management type framework that the NIACS group has developed that we implemented as part of this project. So we defined each of the areas of interest. We took a look at the climate change impacts and vulnerabilities for that particular forest ecosystem type that we had chosen. We evaluated and developed management objectives for that ecosystem type. And here's where we started asking questions about, is our typical view of a desired future condition still relevant given what we know about future climate change? Then we identified the adaptation approaches and tactics, so that's kind of the silvicultural prescriptions that we developed for each of the treatments. And then there's a monitoring plan. And so this is that typical adaptation framework. So what we ended up doing for each of the 5 sites that we currently have as part of the network is we conducted a 3-day workshop at each site. The photos from right here are from the first one that we did in Minnesota, which was in 2013. And so the first day of the workshop was a broad workshop for stakeholders and kind of a broader audience. And we started out with basic climate science. We talked about climate change trends and impacts and vulnerabilities for that local region. Then we walked everybody through a considerations exercise so people could really start thinking about, well, what are going to be the impacts on our forest ecosystems of these climate changes? And then we walked through an exercise with them to help them develop adaptive silvicultural prescriptions in response to that. So they walked away with some training and tools. On day 2 and 3, we had a smaller group of people who were focused on developing the experiment themselves at each of the sites. So the first thing we did on the second day is we would go out in the field, we'd revisit what those primary climate impacts and vulnerabilities were for that particular ecosystem type. So here we're in a red pine forest. And then we went back into the office and we really got to work developing what these treatments would look like. So again, the treatments are resistance, maintaining relatively unchanged conditions over time. Our definition of resilience is to allow some change, but we have this benchmark or condition that we really want the system to bounce back to. Okay? And this is a term that we use a lot. Resilience. And so we want an eventual return to a desired condition, and then transition. We're actively facilitating change and adaptive responses to new conditions into the future. So again, a spectrum from basically wanting to maintain what we have to actively changing that system for the future. So back in the office, for each experimental treatment, we defined what a desired future condition would look like. Then we developed a set of management objectives that would fit that DFC for that treatment type. And then we came up with the silvicultural practices to meet that. And this part of the process is a little bit backwards to how silviculturists often think, where they might start with management objectives given who the landowner is. But because we had this project that we were overlaying, we started with the DFC and then worked our way down. Okay, and then day 3, we finalized the treatments, we developed a monitoring plan, we walked away with a task list of who was going to do what and what needed to happen after that. This is just a schematic of our plot design. I think Jacob will talk about this a little bit. And so everybody's kind of using the same basic data collection strategy. I'm not going to walk through these questions. We have a set of management-related questions that range everything from taking a look at what happens to our notion of a desired future condition, what are some of the trade-offs of managing in this adaptive way versus a more traditional way of management. We also are building a set of scientific questions that we're asking both at each individual site and then across all of the sites. And so we're starting to enter into this zone of being able to collect data and start addressing these. So I'll give you a really quick whirlwind tour of where the sites are. Jacob will talk extensively about the Minnesota site. This is on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest. It's a red pine dominated site, and the climate considerations are drought, a warming temperature, an increased risk of fire. Yes, there's fire in northern Minnesota, and an increased risk for insect and disease outbreaks. The site in New Hampshire is on the Second College Grant. It's associated with Dartmouth. It's a private property. It's a beautiful northern hardwood site, and some of their climate considerations are around increased wind and ice events, increased extreme precipitation events, potentially drought, and they're really interested in how that balance of species composition might change into the future and the impacts of that. The Jones Center in Georgia is a longleaf pine-dominated site that has fire as a major component of the ecosystem. Their climate concerns revolve around drought severity and extreme weather events. the San Juan National Forest site, which you all know where that is in the southwest part of the state, is a warm dry mixed conifer forest type, and our considerations there are warming climate, variable precipitation, earlier snow melt, and increased risk of wildfire and insects and disease. And then our last site is on the Flathead National Forest in northwest Montana, which is a larch dominated site. And along with other conifers, and our climate concerns there revolve around an uncertain precipitation future, earlier snowpack melt, and increased risk of wildfire. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these slides. They'll be available, and I'm happy to share them with anybody. This basically represents all the different treatments that were designed across all of the different sites. So if you had time to look at them, it would demonstrate a wide variety of management styles to meet the different treatments, resistance, resilience, transition. This is allowing us as a group to start asking some questions about, well, which of these sites are we considering drought species, and which are we considering fire adapted species into the future? Which of these are typical regeneration cuts versus other types of management approaches? Which increase heterogeneity? And there's a trend here in that the resilience and transition treatments are all trying to promote heterogeneity across the landscape. And this slide shows when we're thinking about the species that we're promoting into the future, both planting and also species that currently exist, which ones are future adapted, which ones are current adapted. And we have planting happening at most of the sites, and that's actually giving us a lot of opportunity to ask some really interesting research questions around how those different species will respond to different climates into the future. So, just to wrap up, in sum, we have about 2,100 acres as part of this study. Each study is about 500 acres in size, replicated 4 times. We have 3 national forests involved in the project, 3 research stations, 2 large private entities, Dartmouth and the Jones Center. 6 universities are currently engaged in the project. There's been over 275,000 seedlings that have gone in the ground already, and there'll be 6,400 more into the future. We have 706 remeasurement plots that have been installed across all of the sites. So it's a big project that's requiring a tremendous amount of coordination. I stole this slide from Courtney. She recently put this together. This is our team of collaborators. Most of our collaborators were here in January, and this was the first time that some of these folks had met. It was the first time we'd all been in the same place all at the same time, and it was a really productive meeting where we were able to start really exploring what kind of interesting questions we might start asking across this network. And so just to summarize, this project is a really nice example of adaptive management at work that's been applied to a variety of different forest types to really start testing some of these ecological theories around resistance, resilience, transition. They're really broad, complex concepts that we have brought down to a locally relevant scale. This is truly a manager-scientist partnership where we have co-generated the questions, the ideas, and we're going to co-generate the knowledge that comes from the project. The range of treatments are allowing us to demonstrate to managers in the scientific community short-term approaches, mid-term approaches, and longer-term approaches to forest management in the context of climate change. It highlights the value of long-term forest research, which is sometimes really hard to maintain, and it's an example of really translating science into practice. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and hand this over, I think, to Jacob really quickly.